April 12, 1945, General George S. Patton had seen death on every battlefield in Europe. He had watched men blown apart by artillery, seen tanks crush soldiers beneath their treads, walked through fields littered with the dead. None of it broke him. He was iron, unshakable. But on this morning, when the gates of Buchenwald concentration camp swung open, the man who had never flinched in combat stepped back and turned away. His hands trembled, his face went pale, and for the first time in the war, George Patton wept. What he witnessed inside those gates would change him forever. The general who had conquered North Africa, who had liberated France, who had broken the German army at the Battle of the Bulge, that same general would later write in his diary that Buchenwald was the most horrible sight he had ever seen. This is the story of that day, the day the war stopped, being about strategy, and became about something far darker. The day George Patton discovered what he had really been fighting against. The morning of April 12, 1945, began like any other for 3rd Army headquarters. Staff officers shuffled papers, radio operators monitored German frequencies, and logistics teams calculated fuel consumption for the continuing advance into Germany. Patton sat in his command vehicle, studying maps of the Thuringian region. His forces were moving fast, faster than anyone expected. German resistance was collapsing. Towns were surrendering without a fight. The end of the war was finally visible on the horizon. An intelligence officer approached with a report. Allied reconnaissance had identified a large facility near the town of Weimar. Initial reports suggested it was some kind of prison camp. The Germans called it Buchenwald. Patton glanced at the report without much interest. He had liberated dozens of prisoner-of-war camps already. French soldiers, British airmen, American infantrymen captured during the Bulge. Liberating camps was routine by now. Send a company, secure the perimeter, process the prisoners, move on. But something in this report was different. The reconnaissance photographs showed strange structures, large chimneys, railroad tracks leading directly into the facility. And the estimated prisoner population was staggering, tens of thousands. Patton decided to see this camp himself. He had made a habit of visiting the front lines personally, seeing with his own eyes what his men encountered. It was one of the reasons 3rd Army moved so fast. While other generals commanded from distant headquarters, Patton commanded from the field. He understood what his soldiers faced because he faced it alongside them. The drive to Buchenwald took less than an hour. Patton traveled with a small convoy, just 2 jeeps and a security detail. He preferred moving light and fast. As they approached the camp, the landscape began to change. The forests of Thuringia gave way to barren ground. Trees had been cut down for miles around the facility. Guard towers rose against the gray sky. Barbed wire fences stretched in every direction. But it was the smell that stopped them first. 1 mile from the camp gates, a horrible stench filled the air. Patton's driver slowed the jeep involuntarily. The security detail exchanged glances. They were combat veterans who had smelled death before, on battlefields across Europe. This was different. This was something none of them had ever encountered. Patton said nothing. He gestured for the driver to continue. The gates of Buchenwald stood open when they arrived. American soldiers from the 6th Armored Division had secured the camp earlier that morning. They stood at the entrance in small groups, not talking, not moving. Some were sitting on the ground with their heads in their hands. Others stared at nothing, faces blank with shock. Patton stepped out of his jeep and straightened his uniform. He was wearing his famous helmet with the 3 stars, his riding boots polished to a mirror shine, his ivory-handled pistols at his hips. He looked every inch the conquering general. But as he walked toward the gates, something changed in his bearing. His confident stride slowed. His shoulders tensed. The soldiers at the entrance snapped to attention when they recognized him, but Patton barely acknowledged them. His eyes were fixed on what lay beyond the gates. The first thing he saw was the bodies, stacked in piles, dozens of them, hundreds. Emaciated corpses with skin stretched tight over bones, mouths frozen open in silent screams. They had been left where they fell, or where they had been thrown, like garbage discarded without thought. Patton stopped walking. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the horror before him. Behind him, his aide began to speak, perhaps to offer some explanation, some context for what they were seeing. Patton raised his hand for silence. He needed no explanation. The evidence was overwhelming. This was not a prison camp. This was not a place where enemy soldiers were held until the war ended. This was a factory of death. The general forced himself to move forward. He walked past the piles of bodies, past the barracks where survivors huddled in darkness, past the medical building where Nazi doctors had conducted experiments too horrible to describe. With each step, the scope of the atrocity became clearer. This camp had held over 50,000 prisoners: Jews, political dissidents, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, Roma, anyone the Nazi regime deemed unworthy of life. They had been worked to death, starved to death, beaten to death. And when they died, their bodies were burned in massive crematoriums that operated day and night. Patton saw the crematoriums. He saw the ovens, still warm. He saw the ash pits where human remains had been dumped. The survivors were almost harder to look at than the dead. They emerged from the barracks like ghosts, skeletal figures in ragged striped uniforms. Their eyes were enormous in their shrunken faces, hollow and haunted. Many were too weak to stand. They crawled toward the American soldiers, reaching out with hands that were nothing but skin and bone. Some wept, some laughed hysterically, some simply stared, unable to comprehend that liberation had finally come. Patton watched as his soldiers tried to help. They offered food from their rations, chocolate bars, and canned meat and bread. The survivors grabbed at it desperately, stuffing it into their mouths, but their bodies had been starved for so long that many could not digest solid food. They vomited immediately, then tried to eat again. Medical officers would later establish strict protocols for feeding concentration camp survivors, but on this first day, no one knew. They only knew these people were dying and needed help. Patton saw a young soldier, barely 20 years old, kneeling beside an elderly prisoner. The soldier was crying openly, holding the prisoner's hand, telling him over and over that he was safe now. The prisoner did not respond. He was already dead. The general continued his tour of the camp. He insisted on seeing everything, every building, every corner of this nightmare. His staff tried to dissuade him. They had seen enough. They understood what this place was. But Patton refused to leave until he had witnessed the full extent of German cruelty. He entered the barracks, where prisoners had slept, if sleep was even possible in such conditions. Wooden bunks stacked 4 high, each level, meant to hold one person but crammed with 3 or 4. The floor was covered with filth. The stench was unbearable. Survivors lay on the bunks, too weak to move, watching the American general with expressions that mixed hope and disbelief. Patton stopped beside one bunk, where an older man lay, motionless. The man's eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. Patton thought he was dead until the man slowly turned his head and looked at the general. He said something in German, his voice barely a whisper. Patton did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The man was asking if it was really over. Patton nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. Outside the barracks, Patton found a group of his officers waiting. They had completed their own inspection of the camp and were compiling reports. One officer approached with a clipboard, ready to brief the general on prisoner numbers, facility layout, logistical requirements for providing aid. Patton cut him off. He did not want numbers. He did not want logistics. He wanted to understand how this had happened, how an entire nation had allowed such evil to exist, how human beings had done this to other human beings. The officer had no answers. None of them did. They were soldiers trained for combat, not philosophers equipped to explain the depths of human cruelty. But Patton kept asking questions anyway, as if speaking the horror aloud might somehow make it comprehensible. He asked about the guards. Where were they? Most had fled before the Americans arrived, the officer explained. Some had been captured. Some had been killed by prisoners, who finally had the strength to fight back. Patton nodded slowly. He said that any guard captured should be held for trial. They would answer for what they had done here. The crematoriums were the worst. Patton stood before the massive ovens where thousands of bodies had been burned to ash. The fires had been extinguished, but the heat still radiated from the brick structures. Partially burned remains were visible inside. Nearby, enormous piles of ash and bone fragments represented the final evidence of lives extinguished. A German prisoner who had worked in the crematorium was brought forward to explain the operation. The man spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, describing how bodies were transported from the barracks, how the ovens were loaded and operated, how the ashes were disposed of. He explained that the crematoriums had operated continuously, sometimes burning hundreds of bodies per day. He explained that when the ovens could not keep up with the death rate, bodies were buried in mass graves or simply left to rot. Patton listened to every word. His face remained expressionless, but those who knew him could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When the prisoner finished speaking, Patton turned and walked away without a word. Behind one of the barracks, away from his men, Patton finally broke. The general, who had never shown weakness, who had slapped soldiers for crying, who believed that courage was the greatest virtue and fear the greatest sin. The general leaned against a wooden wall and wept. His aide found him there several minutes later. The young officer had never seen Patton like this. The general's face was wet with tears, his breathing ragged. For a moment, the aide did not know what to do. Protocol did not cover this situation. Finally, he simply stood nearby, offering silent presence without intrusion. Patton composed himself slowly. He wiped his face with a handkerchief, straightened his uniform, and took several deep breaths. When he turned to face his aide, his expression had hardened into something cold and fierce. The tears were gone, replaced by a fury that seemed almost inhuman in its intensity. Patton said that he wanted every soldier in Third Army to see this place, every single one. He wanted them to know what they had been fighting against. He wanted them to understand why this war had to be won completely, unconditionally, without mercy for those who had created such horror. Patton made good on that promise. In the days following the liberation, he ordered units of Third Army to tour Buchenwald. Thousands of American soldiers walked through the camp, seeing for themselves the evidence of Nazi atrocities. Many had the same reaction Patton did. Hardened combat veterans broke down crying. Some vomited. Some flew into rages, attacking German prisoners or civilians they encountered. Military police had to restrain soldiers who wanted to kill every German in sight. Patton also ordered the civilian population of nearby Weimar to tour the camp. He wanted the German people to see what their government had done in their name. He wanted them to understand the consequences of their complicity, whether active or passive. Columns of German civilians were marched through Buchenwald, past the bodies, past the survivors, past the crematoriums. Many claimed they had not known what was happening. Patton did not believe them. The camp was only 5 miles from Weimar. The chimneys had been visible for years. The smell had carried on the wind. They had known, Patton believed. They had simply chosen not to see. That night, Patton returned to his headquarters and wrote in his diary. His entry for April 12, 1945, is one of the most powerful documents of the war. He described what he had seen in unflinching detail: the bodies, the survivors, the crematoriums, the absolute evil of the Nazi regime. He wrote that Buchenwald was beyond anything he had imagined possible. He had known the Germans were brutal. He had fought them for 3 years across 2 continents. But he had never conceived that any nation, any people, could sink to such depths of depravity. The diary entry also revealed something else, a change in Patton himself. Before Buchenwald, he had fought the war as a professional soldier. The Germans were the enemy because his country was at war with them. Victory was the goal because victory was always the goal. But after Buchenwald, the war became personal in a way it had never been before. The Germans were no longer just enemies to be defeated. They were criminals who had committed unspeakable crimes against humanity, and Patton would show them no mercy. The liberation of Buchenwald had immediate effects on Third Army operations. Patton pushed his forces even harder, driving deeper into Germany with relentless aggression. He wanted the war over. He wanted the Nazi regime destroyed completely. Every day the fighting continued was another day that other camps might be operating, other prisoners might be dying. His staff noticed the change in him. Patton had always been aggressive, but now there was something almost desperate in his urgency. He slept less. He ate less. He spent more time at the front lines, personally directing operations. When subordinates suggested pausing to consolidate gains or wait for supplies, Patton refused. There was no time to wait, not anymore. German commanders noticed the change too. Third Army attacks became even more ferocious, even more relentless. Patton seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing at critical moments to drive his troops forward. The German word for Patton had always been respectful, acknowledging him as a worthy adversary. Now it became something closer to fear. The Americans were no longer just fighting to win. They were fighting with the fury of men who had seen true evil. Buchenwald was not the only concentration camp Third Army liberated. In the following weeks, Patton's forces discovered Ohrdruf, Flossenburg, and dozens of smaller camps. Each one revealed new horrors. Each one reinforced Patton's conviction that the Nazi regime represented something uniquely evil in human history. At Ohrdruf, Patton insisted that Generals Eisenhower and Bradley visit to see the evidence for themselves. Eisenhower came on April 12th, the same day Patton had first visited Buchenwald. The Supreme Commander walked through the camp in silence, his face growing paler with each step. When the tour ended, Eisenhower made a statement that echoed Patton's own feelings. He said that he had never imagined such cruelty, such sadism, such bestiality could exist. He ordered every American unit in the area to visit Ohrdruf. He wanted the evidence documented extensively, photographed, and filmed from every angle. He knew that someday someone would try to deny these crimes had happened. The evidence had to be overwhelming and irrefutable. Patton's response to the concentration camps also had a darker side. His hatred of the Nazi regime extended in his mind to all Germans. He made statements that troubled his superiors and would later damage his career. He suggested that the entire German nation bore responsibility for the camps. He proposed harsh measures for the occupation that went far beyond official policy. His anger was understandable given what he had witnessed, but it was also dangerous. A commanding general could not let personal emotion drive military decisions. Eisenhower counseled Patton privately, acknowledging the horror of what they had seen while urging restraint. The war would end soon. The occupation would begin. America would need to rebuild Germany, not destroy it. Justice would come through trials and legal processes, not through vengeance. Patton listened but did not fully agree. He believed that some crimes were too great for courts and lawyers. Some crimes deserved immediate punishment. But he followed orders, channeling his anger into the military campaign rather than unauthorized reprisals. The psychological impact of Buchenwald stayed with Patton for the rest of his life. Those who knew him well said he was never quite the same after April 12th, 1945. The confidence was still there, the aggression, the tactical brilliance. But there was also a darkness that had not existed before. In quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching, Patton would stare into the distance with an expression that suggested he was seeing something far away, something terrible. He rarely spoke about Buchenwald directly. When asked about the liberation, he would provide factual answers without emotion. The camp held approximately 50,000 prisoners. American forces arrived on April 11th. He visited on April 12th. The facts were a shield against the memories, but his diary revealed the truth. Entries written in the weeks after Buchenwald show a man wrestling with profound questions about humanity, evil, and the purpose of war. Patton had always believed in destiny, in the glory of combat, in the nobility of the warrior tradition. Buchenwald challenged all of those beliefs. There was nothing noble about what he had seen, nothing glorious, only horror without meaning. The war in Europe ended less than a month after Patton visited Buchenwald. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Patton should have been triumphant. Third Army had fought from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, covering more ground and capturing more enemy prisoners than any other American force. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve. Yet the victory felt hollow. At the surrender celebrations, Patton remained subdued. He posed for photographs and shook hands with dignitaries, but the famous Patton fire was missing. When asked about his feelings, he gave brief, non-committal answers. He was thinking about what came next. The war against Germany was over, but the suffering was not. Millions of displaced persons wandered across Europe. Concentration camp survivors struggled to rebuild lives that had been destroyed. The dead remained unburied, their stories untold. And the criminals who had created this nightmare were only beginning to face justice. Patton wanted to be part of that justice. He wanted to ensure that the perpetrators of Buchenwald and camps like it would pay for their crimes. In the months after the war, Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. It was an administrative position, far removed from the combat command he loved, but it gave him authority over the denazification process, the Allied effort to purge former Nazi officials from positions of power. Patton approached this task with characteristic intensity, but his methods soon caused controversy. He was accused of being too lenient with former Nazis, particularly those with administrative skills needed to rebuild German infrastructure. Critics said he was more interested in fighting the Soviets than in punishing Germans. Patton's defense was complex and often contradictory. He believed in justice for concentration camp guards and SS officers, but he also believed that ordinary Germans, those who had joined the Nazi Party out of necessity or opportunism, should be rehabilitated rather than punished. The distinction made sense to him, but was difficult for others to accept. How could a man who had wept at Buchenwald now advocate mercy for any Nazi? The controversy eventually contributed to Patton's removal from command in October 1945. George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, from injuries sustained in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. The accident occurred just 12 days after the crash, during which time Patton lay paralyzed in a military hospital. Those who visited him said he faced death with the same courage he had shown in battle. He did not complain, did not express fear, did not ask for pity. He simply waited for the end, as a soldier waits for orders. Some historians have wondered whether Patton ever truly recovered from what he saw at Buchenwald. The physical cause of death was clear, a broken neck from the car accident. But the psychological wounds were invisible, and perhaps just as fatal. Patton had seen the worst that humanity could do to itself. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. In his final diary entries, written in the weeks before his death, Patton returned again and again to questions of meaning and purpose. He wondered why God had allowed such evil to exist. He wondered whether the war had truly accomplished anything. He wondered whether humanity would learn from its mistakes or simply repeat them. The legacy of Buchenwald lives on, preserved in museums and memorials that ensure future generations will never forget what happened there. The legacy of George S. Patton lives on, too, in military academies where his tactics are studied, in history books where his campaigns are analyzed, in the memories of those who served under him. But perhaps the most important legacy is the one that connects these two stories. A general who had seen every horror of war, who had become hardened to death and destruction, who believed himself immune to weakness, That general was broken by what he saw at Buchenwald. Not broken permanently, not broken completely, but broken enough to weep, to question, to change. Patton's tears at Buchenwald remind us that even the strongest among us have limits, that some horrors are too great for any human being to witness without being affected, and that the capacity to weep at injustice, to be moved by suffering, to feel the weight of evil, that capacity is not weakness. It is what makes us human. George Patton was many things: a warrior, a general, a leader of men. But on April 12, 1945, he was simply a man confronting the darkest chapter in human history. And for one moment, that was enough to break even him. What would you have done if you stood at those gates? General Patton commanded armies and conquered nations, yet Buchenwald brought him to his knees. It makes you wonder about the true cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in souls forever changed. Patton never forgot what he saw that day. Neither should we. Tell me in the comments, do you think witnessing such horror changed Patton for the better or for the worse? And if you have a family member who served in World War II, share their story below. These memories deserve to be remembered. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another story from history.